Session 8 of Project Management. This time we're going to return to the subject of leading the people in your project team effectively. There is definitely a shift in project management and leadership generally from planning techniques being all important towards the people issues being even more important.
Project Management Session 8. In this session we're going to develop some thoughts on both leading and managing the project and the people. In particular, we're going to look at just some of the psychological issues involved in how people work together, particularly in the area of perception. We will also explore a contemporary concept known as SCARF in relation to motivation, and also how to handle conflict in the project team. Enjoy! Slide 2. People, the common thread. Now, whatever the nature of the project, it requires that people work together effectively. And it's important to remember that no two people are alike, and we all have different needs. We'll look at working preferences with two approaches to enable us to work more effectively with individuals, both in the project team and with other stakeholders. The 6 psychological concepts relevant to project working are perception, cognition, motivation, personality, communication, and behaviour. So, before moving on to the next slide, just give some thought to the study questions. Firstly, do you know what makes each of your project members... Study questions. Do you know what makes each of your project team members tick? What are their individual attributes? And do you think their values are in alignment with the project philosophy? Slide 3. A key psychological concept in project working is that of perception. No two people interpret a situation, experience or event in exactly the same way, and the internal representation of a situation, experience or event is what we call our perception of that situation, experience or event. And an important skill of the project manager and leader is to become aware of the perceptions of other people, both in the project team and the other stakeholders, and understand how those people see events and interpret them. So, your study questions and issues to debate for this particular slide are as follows. Firstly, have there been any significant differences in perception which have caused problems with the project or projects in which you are currently engaged? How did you address those differences? What were the outcomes? Slide 4. In this slide we see the principle of multiple perspectives. Given a situation, we tend to view things through our eyes from what we call first position. This is, after all, the leadership position, what we think about a situation. The first step in developing advanced perception skills is to develop the ability to see a situation through the eyes of the other people involved, both within the project team and with the other stakeholders. We call this second position. And then a major development occurs when we can fly up into our mental helicopter and view the situation in an objective manner, as would an uninvolved individual such as a consultant. And the next stage in developing our perceptual skills is to imagine that the helicopter has a video camera attached to it, to which we can attach various lenses. Firstly, the creative lens, looking at all possibilities, the critical lens, looking at possible problems, legal and financial aspects, if you like, the black holes in the situation, and then the realistic lens, which puts together the balance between the creative and the critical perceptions. Finally, fourth position can be very useful. It can be a very useful addition, and that's where we consult someone who is outside the project, but who can provide useful feedback on the first, second and third perceptions already created. This is a powerful model, so let's explore it with the study questions. Can you identify a situation which lends itself to the multiple perspectives analysis model shown in this slide? What would your analysis look like if you applied the principle of multiple perspectives to a project on which you are currently working? Slide 5. Human beings process information and make meaning from it in a number of ways, and a convenient approach to the modes of thinking is the split brain approach introduced by Roger Sperry in the 1960s. And the idea is that we have two types of thought process: left brain thinking, all about logic and stuff, right brain thinking, all about spatial artistic stuff. Now these are not necessarily centered in the left or right brain hemispheres, but are more akin to different types of thinking process distributed throughout the brain. Now an effective project leader and manager needs to have both left brain skills relating to logic, analysis, facts, numbers and so forth, together with right brain skills involving patterns, colour, rhythm, spatial issues and the other so-called creative aspects of the project. In Western society, most of us rely heavily on left brain skills for success, whereas in reality it is access to both modes of thinking behaviour which is important. There's a fabulous book by an author called Betty Edwards, and it's called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, and it's a really useful tool for developing right brain skills. Betty Edwards used this with engineering graduates to develop their creativity in the USA, and it really is a powerful tool for developing your creativity as a project manager and leader. And then also there is Tony Buzan's work on mind mapping. Tony Buzan created the concept of mind mapping in the late 1960s, and over the years it has been found to be a tremendously powerful tool for creative thinking. Applied to project working, it is incredibly powerful for picking up all those little aspects which sometimes we might forget. So your study questions for slide 5 are these. Firstly, are you heavily left brain in terms of your thought processes, relying on facts and lists and analysis? To what extent do you use the right brain skills of creativity, spatial, and all that sort of perhaps slightly flaky stuff, which actually is the essence of creativity? What steps have you taken to develop your right brain skills? Slide 6. Motivation and the project team. Motivation is a subject which has attracted interest since the start of the human race, and during the 1950s a number of writers proposed models of motivation, and these included people like Maslow and Herzberg and House and McGregor, lots and lots of people. Now back in 2005 I built on these ideas and I've integrated them to produce a 6-factor model. And this is built on the concepts of 4 factors which inoculate against demotivation and 2 which promote motivation itself. Now the basic drivers against demotivation are as follows: when the individual feels significant in terms of the work that they undertake. Secondly, where they feel there's a sense of certainty about the way ahead, and that's obviously where good leadership comes in. Thirdly, where they experience variety in their work. And then number 4, where they feel there's a strong connection to the rest of their team and the organisation as a whole. Now those 4 factors are very important, because if they're not satisfied, then the individual runs the risk of being demotivated. However, no matter how much resource you put into those 4 factors, they do not guarantee motivation. The two main drivers of motivation are when the person has a sense or a feeling that they are growing as a person, and secondly, that they feel and they are recognised as making a valued contribution to something worthwhile. These are the true motivational drivers. So our model then has 4 things to inoculate us against demotivation and 2 positive things to promote motivation. Now your study questions are these. Firstly, thinking about the individual members of your project team, to what extent are they inoculated against demotivation by having their needs met in terms of significance, certainty, variety and connection? Secondly, to what extent would you believe that their motivator needs of feeling that they're growing as a person and that they are making a valued contribution to something worthwhile met? Let's give some thought to those questions before moving on to the next slide. Slide 7. Now let's move on and look at the idea of SCARF. SCARF is a brain-based model for collaborating with others. So this is another approach to motivation. It's called SCARF because those 5 letters stand for 5 words. We'll look at those very shortly. This is a brain-based model for collaborating with and also influencing others. It comes from the world of neuroscience, which is all about understanding how the brain works, and it's based on a well-known psychological concept known as approach avoidance theory. This is basically that we are attracted to things that reward us and try to avoid things that threaten us. And there are 2 very useful internet references to the meaning of SCARF. One very general one is given at edbatista.com, and that reference is on the slide. But probably the most practical, pragmatic one in terms of leadership and management of a project team is that written by David Rock, and that's at academy.clevelandclinic.org. Again, the full reference is there. Now, SCARF is based on the 5 ideas of status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And each of these concepts is explored in terms of increasing the perceived rewards from these 5 areas and reducing the threats. In many ways, it's a sort of parallel to my theory of 2005. But what it does is to add the concept of specific factors which reward and then those that reduce threats in those 5 areas. Now, David Rock's article in the Neuro Leadership Journal, issue 1, 2008, provides a really comprehensive overview of SCARF and how the model may be applied in practice. So your study assignment for this slide is to download David Rock's paper on SCARF, and you've got the reference there, academy.clevelandclinic.org, and spend some time working through the approach avoidance aspects of SCARF. How can you apply these 5 factors to the work of the project team in which you are involved or which you lead? Slide 8. Understanding preferences. Now, there are many tools that we can use to understand personality and work style, and many of these involve the concept of preferences, or what we like to do, what we prefer to do. The most commonly encountered tool based on preferences is the Myers-Briggs Type Inventory, MBTI, which reflects Jung's psychological approach to personal preferences. Now, this looks at 4 bipolar dimensions: where the individual derives their energy from, integrating with others, or reflecting on their own. Secondly, the type of data they believe, that is, here and now specific data, or perhaps more diffuse interaction patterns and softer data. Number 3, whether they're driven by logic or more by emotional values. And then number 4, the way to which they are structured in their way of working. Do they need control or simply to go with the flow? An awareness of preferences based on the MBTI model is really useful, as it enables the project leader and manager to deal with each individual in the most effective way. Now, there are lots of books on MBTI. It's difficult to recommend just one book. If you really are interested in understanding preferences, it's probably useful to go on an MBTI course, and these are run by a company called OPP in Oxford. However, a Google search is very, very useful, particularly in this case. If you were to carry out, and this is your study assignment now, to carry out a Google or similar search on Myers-Briggs type inventory, you'll find a lot of references, and in fact you can complete an online personal assessment of your MBTI type at www.humanmetrics.com, and you have there the reference actually on the slide. So give some thought to preferences, think about your project team. What do you think they would actually have as an MBTI profile on those 4 factors: energy, data, what they're driven by, logic or emotion, and whether they're control people or people who simply go with the flow. Slide 9. Now let's have another look, or another view, of preferences. This particular idea in slide 9 is based on the work of Hippocrates thousands of years ago, and Hippocrates defined 4 types of people. There was the so-called sanguine, who wasn't really worried by much, was a fun lover, liked to interact, liked fun in life. The second one was the phlegmatic, the calm person, who did everything to avoid conflict and live in harmony. The third one was the melancholic, who was very much into detail and control. The fourth one was the choleric, the sort of leadership type preference, into bullet points, into risk, into making it happen, perhaps a rather aggressive person. Now, the Hippocrates model can actually be explained with 2 scales overlapping at 90 degrees. The horizontal scale ranges from submissive to assertive, and the vertical scale up top is open with emotions down to closed with emotions. So, for example, the person that we would call the sanguine, we call the blue in this model, very open with emotions and very assertive. The yellow is very much submissive but open with emotions. The green, submissive but closed with emotions, whereas the red, very much a task-orientated personality preference, is very assertive and closed with their emotions. So these are the 4 types of personality. The blue, who is essentially people-orientated, fun-loving, highly interactive, and a good communicator and networker. The yellow, who's very people-orientated and seeks to build harmony and avoid conflict. The green, who's driven by attention to detail and control. And the red, who likes to be in control, is drawn to risk and sees themselves as a leader. Now, the key point with this model is to remember that we have to treat people the way they want to be treated, not the way that we would want to be treated. For example, if you're a red, you're part of about 15% of the population. If you treat everybody else as a red, you're going to be wrong 85% of the time. If you are a yellow or a green, each of those colours is about 35% of the population. So if you're a yellow and you treat everybody else like a yellow, you're going to be wrong 65% of the time. So the whole point about this is work out what you're dealing with. And remember, the 4 characteristics are: blue is about fun, yellow is about harmony and lack of conflict, green is about detail, red is about bullet points, control, action, making it happen, leadership. So there's a very, very good exposition of this particular approach to looking at personality preferences by Florence Littauer, and in the bibliography at the end of this session we have got that reference for you. So your study assignment for this slide is to obtain the Personality Plus book by Florence Littauer and work through the questionnaire in that book so that you can identify whether you have red, blue, green or yellow preferences according to her model. Once you've got that under your belt and understand the characteristics, by the way, when you do that questionnaire, you might not agree with what it says about you, and that's interesting because sometimes people want to believe that they're a blue, but perhaps they're actually a red. It's a very, very useful self-awareness tool. Once you've got that under your belt for yourself, think about what characteristics you notice about your project team members in terms of these 4 dimensions of red, blue, green and yellow characteristics. Slide 10. Developing rapport and team spirit. Now, a key attribute of the successful project team is team spirit. Sometimes we call this esprit de corps. In psychological terms, this is closely related to the idea of being in rapport with someone and the other members of the team. And when that happens, we feel we're on the same wavelength. We're in rapport when our words, our tone of voice and body language are similar to the words used by the other person, their tone of voice and their body language. In fact, Albert Moravian back in the 1960s showed that only 7% of a communication is about words, 38% is about tone of voice, and a staggering 55% is about body language. If we can create a common language within the project team, and just focus on that 7%, we can work towards matching both tone of voice and body language as well. We can promote rapport and help develop a common approach to working together, and as a result, team spirit will develop in a positive way. So your study assignment for this slide is to use a Google or similar internet search engine to find out all you can about the phenomenon of rapport. And rapport is a fundamental aspect of neurolinguistic programming, so you might like to do a Google search which has both NLP or neurolinguistic program and rapport mentioned. Practice rapport techniques on strangers to see how quickly you can start to get along with people that you don't know very well. Also, it's useful to practice rapport techniques in a subtle and sensitive way with whom you have found people who are difficult to get on with. So often you find that a conflict isn't just about the fact the other person doesn't like you, but we have a mismatch, we have a lack of rapport. If we can act as if we have got that rapport, then we start to generate it naturally. So have a look at rapport on the internet and start to practice some of the rapport techniques before moving on to the next slide. Slide 11. Handling conflict in the project team. Now, it's inevitable that conflict will occur in a team, and it's important to have ways to handle that conflict. We've already talked about the dysfunctional team where we have to build on trust, facing up to real issues, agreeing on goals, agreeing on standards of performance and focusing on team outputs. But if that conflict has got to a significant level, then we need to have more tools in our toolkit to handle it. And an effective way of dealing with conflict between two members within the team is what we call the forced empathy approach. Now, forced empathy is all based on the fact that people have perceptual differences, and it involves each person separately explaining their view of the conflict situation to the project leader. The two individuals are then brought together, and person A has to explain how they think person B sees the situation until person B is happy with that description. Person B is then asked to explain how they think person A perceives the situation until person A agrees with that description. Now, many conflicts are caused by a difference in perception, and the forced empathy approach can be very effective in resolving such conflicts. Some people would actually argue that over 90% of conflicts are caused by misperceptions. Once one can clarify the perceptual issues and see the situation from the other person's viewpoint, in many cases the conflicts disappear. So your study assignment for this slide, slide 11, just review a conflict situation in which you've been involved or had to resolve, and use the forced empathy approach shown in this slide to explore the situation and its resolution. Would this model have helped arrive at a successful conclusion more rapidly? Slide 12. The psychological side of handling changes. Now, changes will inevitably occur during the duration of a project, and some project team members will find it hard to deal with these changes, and they may become very irritable. Now the Scrum approach, which we've already discussed, handles customer-driven changes very effectively by just getting everybody together and sorting it out. And you would do well to look back at that part of the program and some of the references on Scrum. Now project leaders need to be aware that people have a need for certainty, that they develop comfort zones and are thus sometimes disturbed by changes which they do not understand. Initially they may reject the change through denial, then resist it passively and then perhaps actively, and of course the project leader's task is to encourage the individual to experiment with implementing the change and perhaps with new ways of working. Ultimately, the goal of the project manager is to get the individual to accept the change by experiencing small building blocks of success, and then to become committed to such an extent that they tell others that the change is a good idea, focusing everyone on the benefits of the change. So your study questions for this slide 12 are these. Can you identify a change situation where you personally have passed through the stages of denial, passive then active resistance, exploration and commitment? What change or changes are you now facing in your current project activities where you could apply this idea of change response phases? Slide 13. Plotting interactions that take place within the team. Now the sociogram provides a useful tool for examining the performance and relationships within a project team. And the idea is we can draw a little map and we represent each individual by a circle and then plot the interactions over, say, a 20-minute period. Positive, neutral and negative interactions may be recorded, and a drawing created which shows which individuals tend to work regularly within the group with other people, and which individuals may be seen to be excluded in terms of the communication process. And in the next slide we can see a typical sociogram. But before moving on to that slide, just introduce yourself to the idea of the sociogram in our study assignment. Before moving on to the next slide, please carry out a Google or similar search on sociograms. There are many useful examples and diagrams showing how sociograms can yield a great deal of information about the interpersonal relations within a team or group. Slide 14. This is our last slide for this particular session, and it shows a typical sociogram. A, B, C, D, E and F represent 6 members of a project team in the first few minutes of a project progress meeting. A interacts with C, D, E and F in the initial stages and is probably the project leader. C and F then have a significant number of interchanges, and C then interacts with E. D and E also exchange information, but B seems to be totally excluded from the interactions. This diagram is very basic and can be enhanced easily by placing timings on each interaction together with annotation as to whether they are positive, neutral or negative interactions. It can provide a very useful overview of how a project team works together and can lead to considerable team development when the team becomes aware of how it interacts. Several sociograms for successive meetings would ensure that the representation is a consistent one. An important point about drawing the sociogram is that it must be drawn by someone who is purely observing the project team, not someone who is taking part in the discussions. So your study question for this final slide of session 8 is this. Can you draw a sociogram for 3 consecutive meetings of your project team? What insight into the working relationships do the sociograms provide? And finally, for session 8, let's just have a few words about the references and the bibliography. We've got a number of useful references for this session and use both hard copy books and articles together with internet resources to provide a blended learning approach. The book by Betty Edwards, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, is very effective at developing right brain skills, hence whole brain skills, particularly for engineers, accountants, and those people involved in heavily left brain orientated work. And of course that's where a lot of project managers and project leaders find themselves. Regardless of their innate personal creativity, the work they tend to be involved in tends to be left brain by nature. Likewise, Tony Bazan's mind mapping work is extremely useful for developing right brain thinking skills, and he has published a number of books on the subject. His mind map book is one of the most useful because it's possibly one of the most comprehensive. The SCARF material can be explored using the two internet URLs, and remember, SCARF is this leading edge new approach based on neuroscience, which is all about how people get rewards and avoid threats by the way in which we deal with them. And finally, the personality preference material can be explored in a variety of books covering the Myers-Briggs type inventory. And also Personality Plus by Florence Letard describes the 4 personality types identified by Hippocrates in a very clear and concise manner. And then finally, in terms of understanding sociograms, there is some very, very useful stuff which you can find following a Google search. So that's the end of session 8. I look forward to speaking with you in session 9. Thank you.